Well, welcome everybody. It is March 18th, 2022. Glad to see you all here, and I imagine we'll probably be welcoming a few other folks in the next few minutes as well, or over the course of the next hour perhaps. My name is Brett Nackman. I am the Director of Research for College Autism Network. We're glad to have you here. We know many of you have joined us for our past Canvas meetings, but in case this is your first one, this is the College Autism Network Virtual Association of Scholars. We have monthly webinars, a listserv, and many other resources to engage folks in great conversation around autism and post-secondary education. And today we're delighted to have, I'm going to say a couple of presenters, we had to make a few little adjustments. So our wonderful presenter for today, Dr. Jill Underhill, is unfortunately a bit under the weather, but she's still present and joining us. And we're really glad to have her colleague and co-author, Victoria Ledford, step in to deliver the presentation on their shared research. So we're glad to have both Jill and Victoria here, as well as all of you, and we'll get to their presentation in just a few minutes. But we would like to begin with an icebreaker activity. We start many of our Canvas meetings along these lines. So we're going to encourage you to post in the chat. Kind of our theme for this month is we are a few days away from spring. So what are folks most looking forward to about spring? It could be an activity, it could be an experience, it could be something with the weather. Feel free to post what your interest, what resonates with you about that question. So what are you most excited about regarding spring? And let's see what responses we get in the chat, or if folks want to share verbally, you are welcome to do that as well. So Brad says no more snow, indeed, for our colleague living in Michigan. Lindsay says can't wait for the redbuds to start blooming. Madison, sunshine and being outside. Siobhan says biking instead of taking the bus. Oh yes, embracing that. Aylin also enjoys sunshine. Looks like Yasmin is making a family visit. Elizabeth, herbs in the garden coming back to life. Jill's into hiking. Ken, Jane, others are really welcoming the warm weather. Certainly recognizing that many folks are located in colder regions. Victoria, this is a big one, my PhD graduation in May in sunshine. So we are definitely going to look forward to celebrating that. Matt says pollen and allergies, can't wait. Margaret, sunshine, flowers, fresh grass. Sasha mentions in Southern California, it feels like it is always spring. Yes, indeed. Van BL2, warm weather, hearing the birds, trees, and flowers blooming. Oh, lots of good things to look forward to. Great. So we're going to shift into just a few updates here with College Autism Network. Many of you know and are already part of our listserv, but we have a link in our meeting agenda in case you would like to join our listserv and send out any resources or news articles, or if you're developing a research study. We've had a bunch of folks disseminating information about their projects recently. So it's good to see those being shared. And we also, you may know that we at College Autism Network are shifting into an optional membership model if you are so inclined. And we certainly appreciate your support if you'd like to partake in that. And there are some really great benefits, including discounts for the College Autism Summit. Lee has posted a link for membership in the chat. I would like to ask you, Lee, to put you on the spot. Are there any details you'd like to share, whether it be with the membership or the College Autism Summit in October?
Well, I'm excited to tell you all about something called the Summit Collections. And this is something that, you know, if you've ever presented at a conference and then thought, well, that was really great for the 27 people in my session, but I put all that work into it, and where does it go from here? Or you think, I didn't get to go to some sessions that I really wanted to be at. What we've done, we've taken a a number of the sessions from the 2021 summit, which was last October, and we've grouped them by some topics, some broad topics that we think are of particular interest to all of you. And those presentations on YouTube are actually now available for, if you were at the summit, you get all that for free. But if you didn't go to the summit, you can actually pay a very low price and get access to 4 or 5 or 6 sessions in a particular area that might be of interest. And so we're really pretty excited, and you can find that on our website as well under, I think, resources. So consider spending some of your hard-earned professional development dollars on the summit collections. And the summit is coming up in October again. And I put those dates in there. We're going to be in person, we think, we hope, fingers crossed, in Nashville at Vanderbilt University. And our theme this year, I hope will resonate with some of you, because we're really inspired by the work of Canvas members. Practice Made Better, the shared work of neurodiversity. And this is really about the bridges that we have to build and maintain in our work between researchers and practitioners, between allies and advocates, between employers and campus-based programs, all of those bridges that you routinely are using. So please put that on your calendar. You can follow more information about the summit on our website. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have in the chat, or just send me an email. That's it, Brett.
Thank you, Lee. And I also put a link to the summit collections in the chat as well for folks to, and the agenda for folks to access if you'd like. And yes, Brad has mentioned in the chat that we have a new CAN logo, which we are excited about. So you can see more of that on our website. At this point, we just want to briefly allocate space for folks to share resources, news articles, studies that you're working on where you're perhaps trying to get more information out about it. This would be a great time for you to either put that in the chat or to verbally share that. We have space in the meeting agenda where you can insert information. So I'll start us off, and if folks would like to add on with their own contributions, we certainly welcome it. One piece I would like to inform folks about is that St. Joseph's University is going to be opening a residence hall for students with autism, as this recent Philadelphia Inquirer article makes reference to, that there will be space for up to 17 student residents and 1 student advisor. And certainly there is a very strong presence of members of the autism community there. And it's really exciting to see that being elevated via this as well. So we encourage you to check out that article. And yeah, I just wanted to highlight that. Are there other pieces of information, news, studies that folks would like to share with the larger Canvas community at this time?
I would like to share one, if that is okay. So I am an occupational therapy student, and I'm interested in collecting some voices and perspectives from anybody about sensory inclusion initiatives on college campuses, whether this be lived experiences or maybe practices that are already existing in different institutions or family experiences or whatever it might be. I'm interested in hearing about that. So what I'll do is I'll put an interest form in the chat so that you guys can sign up, or just like give me your information and let me know that you're interested in chatting with me about this topic. And that'd be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Aylin. Absolutely. And we'll make sure we incorporate those details in the meeting minutes as well. Would anyone else like to contribute something?
So I don't know if anybody in here goes to NASPA, which is the one of the National Association for, used to be the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators, which is now, it's one of the leading student affairs organizations. And Lee and I will be there. So hopefully we'll get to see some of you all there and see you in person, which will be the first time for us seeing, heck, it'll be the first time Lee and I see each other for a couple of years, and certainly to see you all. So I hope to see a couple of you there. Wanted to give you a heads up that we have a session there. It's 8:30 in the morning on Monday, which is exactly when everybody wants to get up and go to a session, but maybe there'll be a draw. It's entitled Disability, Difference, and Neurodiversity, Supporting Students Across the Entire Spectrum. So if you happen to be there or are coming, let me or Lee know, and we'll try to hook up. Yes. Oh, that's right. The other, and Lee, you just told me the info about Tom. Do you have that right in front of you?
Just that Tom Beeson and Tanya Olson from Clemson are presenting on Universal Design for Learning, also at NASPA on Monday afternoon, and we're very pleased to have CAN provided some support for their attendance at the summit at NASPA. So.
Great, thanks for sharing, Brad and Lee. And Amy mentions in the chat that they are having a series on neurodiversity and intersectionality that folks can join via Zoom. And the speakers include Nick Walker on March 24th at 4 p.m. and Morinike Giwa Onawu at that's April 20th at 4 p.m. And we'll also put those in the meeting notes so folks can access those too. Thank you, Amy. Seems like a lot of presentations are going on these days. That's great. Any other news or information that folks want to share?
I'll jump on the bandwagon and just add that the registration for the AHEAD conference, the Association on Higher Education and Disability, in July has opened up, and there appears to be almost a complete strand on autism. So almost every concurrent session has a session offering. Not every single one, but almost every one has one related directly to autism. And so good representation there.
And Margaret, where will AHEAD be this coming year?
Cleveland, Ohio.
Great, thank you for sharing. Glad to hear about the autism representation there. Any other things folks would like to share? A lot of great contributions today. Okay, so if folks would like to add further items, please do so in the chat, and we will certainly compile those in our notes as well. At this point, we are going to, let me just make sure I have all of my ducks in a row. Yes, we are going to turn it over to our guest presenter for today. So we have Victoria Ledford, who is a doctoral candidate of communication science and social cognition at the University of Maryland. As I mentioned at the top of our meeting, Dr. Joe Underhill is also joining us. Unfortunately, is a bit under the weather. So Victoria very kindly stepped in to share about their shared research on autistic student success in public speaking courses. They and their colleague have published several pieces on this front, and it's a really compelling topic. And we are just very delighted to have Victoria and Dr. Underhill here this afternoon. I'll turn it over to them. I want to make reference to, if folks have questions or comments they'd like to share, please feel free to put those in the chat. during the last 10 to 15 minutes of their conversation for today during our Canvas meeting, we will have time for that formal Q&A. But Victoria, I'll turn it over to you. You should have access to sharing your screen.
Wonderful. And I'll ask the infamous question, can folks see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, I'm really excited to be here with you all, and I already feel very welcomed with this group. It's lovely to be a part of your group just for today, and excited that Jill asked me to step in. So sad that she's under the weather, and I can assure you that she really is the lead of this project and has done some great work here. Just to briefly introduce myself, so I am Victoria, as Brett mentioned, and right now I'm finishing my PhD at the University of Maryland in communication. And so I study health communication and stigma, so specifically how stigma gets communicated, and in the classroom context, how we can reduce that stigma. Some of that work has been around students with autism, because when I was at Marshall University about 5 years ago getting my master's degree, Jill was my advisor. So really was the person who introduced me to the study of communication and played a large role in my understanding. And while we were there and then after, Jill's work and our work together has really looked at how in communication classrooms can students with autism or autistic students be successful, and how can instructors play an integral role in doing that. So what I want to share with you today is that research and where it has been and where it's going, and why we found it to be important. So I want to start by sharing that at Marshall, we do have the college program for students with autism spectrum disorders. And part of this program really supports students throughout their college career, but has also been really starting an initiative called Allies Supporting Students with ASD. And that's a program that the college program has sponsored. And we, as the communication department and Jill really leading this, helped to get off the ground. And what that program does is actually train instructors and people at the university on autism, and really give some intervention on, here's what autism is. It works to dispel stereotypes or myths about autism, and also help instructors become allies in the classroom. To give some more context about Jill, so her work at Marshall has been really immense, and she served in a variety of roles. So one of the roles that was really crucial for this program was directing the public speaking course in the communication department. And so that's where a lot of our work centered, because of the role that public speaking in that course plays in students' lives, and particularly students with autism. So for additional context there, I think this is sort of a colloquial fact that we all know, that people are really afraid of public speaking, and their number one fear is often public speaking, followed by death. So, that comparison is stark, but I think it's important. And particularly when we're talking about the classroom space now and what that looks like at a time with heightened experiences with anxiety, that social anxiety can also really create a barrier and a challenge for students with autism. And so when we're thinking about what that means in the classroom experience, there are a couple of challenges that we see in the classroom where instructors have the opportunity to support students and support peers of students with autism in becoming better allies. The first one is really thinking about communication apprehension and speech anxiety. And we use those terms differently, but similarly, differently in that communication apprehension is about the spectrum of communication behaviors, one-on-one interactions, group interactions, and then also that public speaking component of really getting in front of a classroom and sharing a speech, which is where speech anxiety comes in. And in a lot of these courses nationally, most of the time, first-year students are the ones enrolled in these courses, and they're one of the only courses that are smaller and where students get to know people. And so, for example, at Marshall, that course has about 19 students, and where I'm at now at Maryland, about 24. And so I've been teaching that course at both institutions and been able to see, this is often students' first exposure to a one-on-one relationship with an instructor, and even those one-on-one relationships with peers. In addition, we know that the class context is a space where college students can make their first friend. And for students with autism, we want to make sure that that's something they have access to as well, and that we as instructors can help them work through that, particularly given the organizational elements and sort of executive functioning that's required for that speaking course. So given this context, the considerations we think about in this research, and I'll talk about 2 studies that we did that really illuminate why these are important. First is UDL, the Universal Design for Learning, which you all have already been talking about as really crucial to how we situate the higher education classroom. And in a public speaking classroom, how we think about expectations for success and expectations for access. So one of the things that you'll learn today from some of the research is about disclosure, and what does it mean when students may or may not have disclosed their autism diagnosis to the institution, may even not have access to diagnostic procedures or know that they have autism. And so what does that look like? And how can Universal Design for Learning be a space where all students learn about different levels of access, and we create a course that makes sure we meet students where they are? At the same time, 2 other sort of philosophies that we incorporate are strengths-based pedagogy, in terms of seeing each student as offering a different level of strength to the classroom environment, and taking it upon ourselves to share with students that that is the model. And so even thinking about the way that speaking rubrics indicate that, how can we write rubric language that doesn't prioritize a certain view of public speaking, that doesn't mandate a certain level of, right, even thinking about, nonverbal behaviors. How can we make those really inclusive? And that's where that belonging piece comes in. It's from before the course even starts, how can we integrate all of these considerations? So as we think about these considerations, Jill has really been the lead on these 2 projects that I've been glad to partner alongside her with, in addition to our colleague, Dr. Hillary Adams, who worked with the college program for students with autism. And so she offered a really valuable perspective from working alongside students throughout their collegiate career. And the real purpose of both of these studies was to understand from the peer perspective, what are students' perceptions of their peers with autism, and how does that inform our work as instructors in knowing this is what that peer perspective is, and now how can we study that among students with autism and support them? So the first study I want to talk about today, and both of them are really centered here, but really began with the understanding that peers are crucial to students with autism success and students more generally. But we know that developing a friendship in the first year of college is a predictor of support, and social support is a predictor of success to graduation. And so as instructors of a course where students are meeting, it's not a large lecture course, students develop relationships, we want to make sure that those relationships can happen for all students. Similarly, with a connected classroom, how can we make sure that students feel connected to us as instructors and like we are a person who can be an ally and a support for them? And both of those are really designed to think about and counter the stigma or the negative perceptions that people often implicitly have towards students with autism. And that's some of what I want to talk about today with our research, is really breaking down where that stigma happens and how we can dispel it in the classroom in an integrated way. And when I say integrated, I mean every part of the course and not just sort of a unit on talking about it, but throughout the course, how can that design really support students? So we approached this first study with a couple of questions in mind. And a central question was looking at how do peers' attitudes and knowledge really influence both students' openness toward their peers with autism and their desired distance from them. And so social distance is sort of a metric to understand stigma. When if you want a more distance from someone, you probably have more stigma toward that group of people, right? And so we want to see way lower social distance, which is sort of the antithesis of openness. And the reason we're asking these 2 questions about knowledge and attitudes is that a lot of the work on anti-stigma intervention or dispelling stereotypes and stigma about autism has looked at knowledge and said, let's share more knowledge. Let's dispel some myths about autism. but we're not entirely sure, sort of as a body of research, if knowledge is the only thing we should be doing. And there's some preliminary evidence indicating we need more than that. We need more than just knowledge about autism. So what do we need? At the same time, these last two research questions were designed to get some open or qualitative feedback from students about what are their attitudes toward interacting with their peers when a peer has exhibited a behavior they might deem as atypical, and what do they think about disclosure? And so the way that we approached this was with a survey that had both close-ended and open-ended questions. Close-ended questions asking about perceptions of attitude, knowledge about autism, openness, and desired social distance. And then those qualitative questions asking, what are your reactions to interacting with students that exhibit these behaviors? And what are your thoughts and beliefs about disclosure? So students who participated in this first study were undergraduates that were enrolled in that introductory communication course that I mentioned. And we had 216 of them in this first study. And what we found with those close-ended questions, thinking about relationships between knowledge, attitudes, openness, and social distance, is that expectedly, as attitudes towards students with autism became more positive, that openness toward interaction increased, right? Which indicates, okay, now we need to sort of think about how can we target those attitudes. However, when we held attitudes constant in that sort of statistical analysis, knowledge wasn't independently an influencer of openness. And that's really leading to that sort of preview I gave you a few minutes ago, that we need more than knowledge. We need intentional interventions that promote positive attitudes towards students with autism. We saw a similar finding with social distance, that more positive attitudes, less social distance. That makes a lot of sense. And so how do we then again increase those positive attitudes with the recognition that knowledge alone is not the thing that we should focus on? And then what we did was we had students read this vignette about a student, and I'll give you a moment to sort of process this, and then I'll read it aloud. But the vignette in the survey was designed to, without using an explicit diagnosis, describe someone who may exhibit behaviors of a student with autism. And so we had students read this vignette and then respond to questions. So I'll give you about a minute to read this over, and then I'll read it aloud, and then I'll talk through our results. So I'll go ahead and read this vignette aloud, and I'm just seeing a message in the chat, so I want to make sure I can see that as well. Thank you, Matthew. So I'll just read this aloud and then share with you the responses. Taylor is a college student, the same age and year as you. Taylor is funny, studious, energetic, and likes attending college. He enjoys all sports, but is a baseball fanatic. He's a good student overall and is majoring in mathematics. Taylor is in the same communication class as you. Through the beginning of the semester, you notice some different characteristics about Taylor. He has difficulty making eye contact when talking and trouble realizing it's time to end a conversation. During class discussion, Taylor has some trouble switching topics. He tends to get fixated on details and has trouble shifting his attention quickly. When he was frustrated one day, he raised his voice at a classmate and left the classroom altogether. You later heard him apologize. You assume Taylor has trouble paying attention because he gets restless, including rocking, shaking his foot, or twirling a pen while people are giving speeches. It is now time to start the semester project for your class. The teacher is assigning groups to all of the students in the class. The project includes a paper and a presentation. Based on the passage, please answer the following questions with what most closely represents your feelings. So after reading this vignette, we asked students to describe, what are your attitudes toward interacting with this student? And we had them describe that in essay format. leaving it open-ended. And then we engaged in a qualitative coding process where we reviewed the themes, met to discuss them, and then refined them. So what you're seeing here are the most common themes. And you'll note that empathy and/or sympathy, which is an important distinction here in some of the responses, was the most common. Another thing we saw was this tolerance for inclusion. And we use the word tolerance here because while we saw students expressing a sentiment of inclusion, that didn't extend beyond saying, that's okay. It was more of, that's just okay, not I would make an intentional effort to work with a student. There were some external attributions where students diagnosed the student and said, this is what we think might be happening. And then a smaller number of students who hesitated to interact with the student. A couple of quotes here that I want to highlight that really showcase the breadth of students' responses are first a student who noted, I'm also a sports fan, even baseball, and I also have speech anxiety, so I understand. However, it may have been unnecessary for him to raise his voice, but it would not deter me from being a friend or not being able to work in class. And so you'll see that appeal to empathy of relating to the student in that way. Alternatively, another student said, if Taylor was in my group assigned by the teacher, I would more than likely be annoyed because I would always get stuck having to do all the work. But I would deal with it if he were willing to work with me and do his share in the project. And these responses that express this hesitation are where we saw some of that stigma, of that development of negative attitudes based on behaviors. Despite the fact that the vignette indicated Taylor was a good student, those sort of social elements negatively influenced and created this hesitation interaction for this student and this stigma about that this person, because of that behavior, might not be a quote unquote good student. Another student noted, I would definitely feel a little hesitant to have Taylor in my class, let alone in a group. He seems like a person who would drag you down. And again, these are those stigmatizing perceptions, which were the smaller perceptions, but are important to note in terms of their implications. Then we also asked people to respond to what they thought about disclosure. Do you think that this student should disclose what their diagnosis might be? Do you think students with autism should be required to disclose that? And we saw a vast number of people note that that's a personal decision and that should be left up to the student. There were some who also indicated it was a privacy concern for disclosure or even unnecessary, whereas a smaller group of students said that might be beneficial for peers to know. Two exemplar quotes here. First, no one should have to know for certain if someone has autism other than the professor. It is their business and their professor's business, not anyone else. That information has no benefit or even gives a benefit from being told to everyone. Another student on the opposite side said, they should make their diagnosis public. That way other students don't get frustrated when the other person may not talk or be able to help much. And discrimination from another student. I think it is good for a student to disclose information like this so they do not get discriminated against more easily. And so what we were seeing here were really two different perspectives. One that's really promoting this sort of personal decision perspective, and another that's really standing sort of in opposition to what a universal design perspective might illuminate, that regardless of our knowledge of those disclosures, we should create a safe classroom space for all. So in terms of how we viewed that study, it really illuminated for us in many ways what work was still needed to be done, and that students, even when they may not have acknowledged it, had some stigma towards those who expressed social behaviors that might characterize students with autism. And so we wanted to get a little bit more in depth then in the second study and look at what are those perceptions even more specifically. And so this study is entirely qualitative and getting more to that depth of peer perceptions, because if we as instructors are going to dispel them, we need to know more of what those perceptions are. So the research questions for this study first wanted to get at what is the knowledge very specifically about autism? What do students know about how students with autism communicate? Because what we were seeing from the first study was, sort of some guesswork about the vignette that student might have autism, but what do they actually know about autism very specifically? Second, what types of beliefs do those students have about whether or not students with autism should participate in that introductory course? So more getting at this perspective of how do peers view students with autism in their courses about speech, when speech is often a behavior that they might stereotype as being something a student with autism can struggle with. And then finally, we really wanted to see, is there a desire on that campus of students who want to learn more about autism as part of that course and then campus-wide? So what did we find here? We asked similar questions and really conducted a study among the same group of students with closed and open-ended questions. And you'll note here the questions we asked correspond to those research questions. So first, we just outright asked them to tell us, what do you know about how autism influences someone's ability to communicate in a classroom setting? Do you believe students with autism should be required to take the introductory communication course? If yes, explain that belief. And if no, also explain that belief. Would you like your class to cover topics on autism, and would you be interested in taking a training? So in asking students what their knowledge about autism was, we saw a vast number of participants comment on communication challenges, followed by what participants described as a lack of awareness, and then social and behavioral challenges. And importantly, a lot of that description was deficit-based rather than strengths-based, and that students did express this mindset that those were challenges. So we saw one student, for example, note, from what I know about autism, it can cause them to miss subtle hints or cultural norms that are easier for most to pick up. And sometimes it requires the instructor to be more direct with nuanced subjects. Another student noted, they often have problems explaining an idea or thought to others, which could prove difficult. And then some students didn't have much knowledge. In asking about your beliefs about whether students should be included in these courses, several students noted that that would be beneficial and commented on how students with autism can benefit from a public speaking course like most students. At the same time, some students expressed sort of this perception that it was only fair if students with autism could be in the same course as them. And that was certainly an interesting point to think about in terms of peer perceptions of inclusion more generally. So we saw one student say, I believe that all students, autistic or not, should take some sort of communication class, although they should not only be limited to only having the option to get up and speak in front of the class, but to choose their own way of communicating. Some communicate better with music, art, etc. Speaking is not the only way to communicate, which frankly is a really inspiring response, given that some of the responses were hard and discouraging to see in terms of stigma communication. And then another student noted, it has been made part of the required curriculum. So if those with autism are attending universities, they should have to suffer through it with everyone else. Clearly a student who was not a fan of a public speaking course. Moving on to the last two, and then I'll wrap up with some implications to give us plenty of time for Q&A. When asking students about their attitudes toward learning about autism, we noted that a lot of students, 114, said, yeah, that would be great to learn about autism in the communication course. Some students said it wasn't appropriate for the course, and others said it wasn't necessary. So for example, one student noted, I would like autism to be covered in relation to communication. I believe that it would be relevant, and learning those patterns of communication is important. This could cause autism to be looked at differently and result in actual friendship building. Another student noted, I was raised in a school that mixed the special education in with normal classes. It's not like we need to study every little thing about their disability. They're just like us. They just don't want to talk to people because they find them annoying. So an interesting perspective from a student sort of promoting equality over equity in the most simplified sense. So what does all of this mean in terms of implications? As we have processed the results, and Jill could certainly speak better to this, so as you're asking your questions, Jill, feel free to start answering those in the chat if you can. The first implication is that faculty need to be the architects of their classrooms. And what we want to communicate here is that we have the ability to change curricula, to change lessons if we don't have that curricular element, but we can specifically design courses and design lessons that help students learn how to become more inclusive, particularly in a communication classroom where we can change rubrics to not mention explicit types of behaviors and really normalize what it means to accept diversity of communication. It also became clear that we need to tell students how to be inclusive, right? We need to not assume that that's just, here's knowledge about it, now do it. I think in all of my research on stigma, one of the most fascinating elements is that after a presentation, people will still use stigmatizing language unintentionally. And that has really helped me learn that they need explicit instruction on what is stigmatizing behavior and language. And then finally, our communication courses are unique opportunities where we have the capacity to help students make friendships, to show students what it's like to include all students. And across the curriculum, this can happen too. So Jill is the director of writing across the curriculum at Marshall. And part of that initiative is also thinking about communicating across the curriculum. So across the institution, where are the spaces where we can structurally support students with autism? In the Fundamentals of Speech Communication course, which is often a general education requirement at most institutions. Also in the core curriculum requirements, thinking about communication specifically and inclusive communication courses. Making sure that capstones and discipline-specific requirements also have these elements that talk about the diversity of communication and how students experience it. And then finally, thinking about degree and postgraduate success. Students with autism may need support learning interviewing skills, as many students do, but very specifically helping ensure that students have access to jobs that are inclusive, that institutions are working to provide that fluency. So these are some of the areas we see our research having an impact. So that's what I have for you today, and would love to hear Q&A. Like I said, Jill might be better answering some of those specific questions about writing across the curriculum, but would certainly open it up for any questions or comments.
Victoria, thank you so very much. That was fantastic. So glad to learn more about these particular studies and efforts. We do have Jill contributed a comment in the chat if you'd like to add to that further potentially, and certainly welcome folks to insert their questions at this time.
Certainly. Yeah, and I think, Jill, I'm glad you brought this up too. I'm really jogging my memory and also bringing back that context where there was this discussion about should students with autism be in communication courses and what does that mean? So there have been perceptions among instructors of what do stemming behaviors or other types of behaviors do to the entire classroom. And so there were these sort of negative perceptions that was disruptive to everyone, rather than showing, okay, how can we include those students and work to show that it's okay, and we just need to think about communication differently. And so getting this data was really crucial for showing that students said students with autism should be in these courses. And so we wanted to have that data to show students want to be inclusive, they may just not know how.
So I joined this conversation today because I am a public speaking teacher and I'm on the spectrum. So this is my wheelhouse. And the first thing I do on the first day of class is I self-disclose. And what that does for all the students in my class is it allows the students with autism to be their authentic selves. And then we can step out into a discussion of what is neurodiversity. And then it allows all the kids with ADHD and dysgraphia and dyslexia and everything else that involves neurodiversity into this class that everyone has to take. And I think a lot of it is, you know, I teach at a community college, so we're smaller and I get to know all the people. Now it's a very large community college, but I get to know the people over in the advising department so that they know to push the students who have a diagnosis into my classroom so that those students can feel more comfortable. But it also means that I've had to train and answer the questions for other members of my faculty on what it means when students are stemming in their classes and how we can modify what presentations mean and modify rubrics, because our rubrics are not set up for neurodiverse people. And, you know, I think we had like one of the comments was everybody will need public speaking in their lives. No, they don't. There are tons of careers out there that you don't need to have any public speaking skills whatsoever. Communication is important, but public speaking is not. And so we made a strong argument that students could take different forms of communication courses and not just the public speaking courses. And then I greatly modify what is acceptable as a public speech. And it's been successful. It is really successful. And so we talk about this, and I give seminars every single semester. What is neurodiversity? And the way I start off with neurodiversity is really, I'm surprised no one has fired me over this, because I start off with, would you be willing to sit in a class with a Black person? Would you be willing to sit in a class and have a woman in your class? Would you be willing to sit in class with a deaf person? What if they were in a wheelchair? What if they were, you know, this, that, and the other? And of course, everyone says, yeah, you can't discriminate like that. And then I say, and you also can't discriminate on the invisible disabilities of neurodiversity. And once we start off with that, people seem to have more of the aha moments. And it's really interesting being one of the few faculty members who is openly autistic to everyone she meets, sometimes more so than they really want to know. Then it helps. And I'm trying to get more people to recognize that, first of all, you know, we've got 50,000 students graduating high school on the spectrum every year. Hey guys, that's a great audience who wants to come to college, and many of whom have this. Yes, I do have examples of modified rubrics. Where can I put those, Brett?
You are welcome to email them to me, and I can include them
Okay.
with some
Note to
materials.
self.
You're also welcome to put those on the listserv. Thank you for those great perspectives there, Amber. I do see that there are some questions that are
Yeah, I just
emerging
saw that.
in the chat
Okay.
as well. In the interest of time, Victoria and Jill, if you might
Sure.
be able to address these. So Matt says for Victoria, I may have missed this, but did you all vary or consider varying the vignette to include on in which the student's diagnosis was disclosed? I wonder if peers would have expressed some different reactions, and maybe that tells us something about the value and impacts of disclosure. So
Yeah,
Victoria.
Thank you for highlighting that. And Amber, thank you for sharing that. I think I've been hearing a lot of instructors talk about disclosure of different types of their condition, like mental health, like disclosing in their syllabus, even, I have anxiety, talk to me. And I think that is just so powerful. And I also would love to see your rubrics as well. I think, thank you. Well said in terms of what that impact is in the diversity of communication. That also relates to this disclosure question that Matthew's pointing out in the chat. So in the vignette, we did not vary disclosure, nor did we indicate a specific diagnosis, because we wanted to see what would it be like if students didn't know its disclosure and saw behaviors in the classroom, which is often the case. And then we asked a specific question later, do you think students should disclose their diagnosis? And I think that really illuminated very preliminarily some of what you're pointing to. What do students think about disclosure? And some of the students said, that's not my business. That's not anyone's business, which is, you know, an interesting perspective that they're saying, like, we don't have that right to mandate disclosure. But then how do we support those students in saying, well, we still need to be inclusive when you don't know? And I think that's the really key point for intervention, is that often we shouldn't mandate disclosure, right? It's not someone's responsibility to say that you have to disclose. So then how do we support students in saying, now let's be inclusive when you can't see, right? Your point, Amber, when you cannot see something, how can you be inclusive? And so I think that's something that really hints at that. And I know Jill's pointing along to some research that she's going to send in follow up in terms of disclosure more specifically, because we were really looking at, sort of this broad perspective, but I think that research that Jill has reviewed is going to be helpful too.
Thank you, Victoria. Another question emerged from Lisa. Oh no, that was in regards to the Amber's point. Great conversation. Any other questions from folks? As we're awaiting potentially other questions, I'll throw one out for you both. I guess one thing I'm wondering is regarding the participants in your studies. Did any of them express having a connection to the disability community themselves? And if so, how did that present that in concert with some of the findings regarding empathy or perhaps lack thereof?
Totally. And I might call on Jill to type some of this out in the chat, because I'm remembering here that we did have some students who said, I'm also autistic, so in their responses. And that's where we saw a lot of that empathy coming from. There were also several students who said like their personal connection, even if it wasn't their identity, like my brother has autism, or I grew up with someone with autism, so like, I'm more familiar. And I think expectedly that did make them more empathetic, understanding, as Jill's pointing, friends, siblings, cousins. And so their perspective was interesting to see that, that personal experience, I think, as we see with a lot of stigma, really did affect sort of more openness and empathy.
Great, thank you for addressing that. Any other questions?
I would love to get access to either the slides or the research sources. Jennifer Murchison from University of Memphis and I are presenting at the AHEAD conference in July on public speaking accommodations and accommodations for verbal participation in classes regarding students with disabilities. And it would be great to have some of this research, recent, rich stuff that we could include in that.
Definitely. And I would bet Jill is already making a note to send that to you, Margaret, because we would certainly be happy to.
Great. And any kind of modified rubrics would be wonderful too, if you don't mind us using that and giving credit to you, because that's where we really want to go with it, is how can you modify in order to be inclusive.
Great. And I see that Jill added in the chat, there's also a doctoral student at University of Alabama doing her dissertation in this area. Good to know. Any final thoughts, Jill and/or Victoria, that you would like to offer to the Canvas community regarding your work?
I will just say thank you. This is, Jill had told me when she said, can you do this for me? I am beyond under the weather. She was like, this is like a really supportive group of people. And I have it typed in the chat, so I'll send it as I say it, that this is a wonderful and supportive space. So I'm really grateful that you allowed me to be a part of it today. So thank you for your interest and engagement.
Yes, I echo what Lindsay just put in the chat. You did a wonderful job, Victoria. I feel the same. Let us definitely send our virtual applause for this great conversation. I think provided a lot of opportunities for reflection and ultimately refinement in practice, as we are seeing illustrated in our colleagues' work as well. Very nicely done. We will certainly share materials out to folks. I know earlier Jill had passed along the actual articles, so if you'd like us to pass those on the listserv, we can. Otherwise, we can direct folks on how and where to access them. This was a great Canvas meeting, everybody. We're glad you could be here. We want to point folks to the fact that our next Canvas meeting will be later in April. It'll be Friday, April 29th. Yes, I should know the dates. Friday, April 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern time. And we're excited to bring on our very own Dr. Brittany L. Jackson at Hiram College. She's on the CAN leadership team with us. Recently defended her dissertation on post-secondary social support programs for students with autism or ASD as described by students, directors, and staff. So Brittany will be here and you'll be among the first to learn about what she discovered. And then a reminder that later in May, we'll have Caden Stockwell talk about their work on understanding the experiences of autistic undergrads at the University of Virginia. So we encourage you to save the date there. We'll certainly provide reminders in our Canvas listserv. A video recording from today will be included with the meeting minutes. So stay tuned for that email later next week. In the meantime, we encourage you to send resources and information via our Canvas listserv. We appreciate everybody's engagement today, and we wish you all a happy and healthy weekend ahead. Take care.